In the winter of 1955, in a quiet Bavarian town, a former Wehrmacht officer sat at his desk and wrote a sentence his commanders would never have allowed him to speak in 1943. He had survived 4 years on the Eastern Front. He had faced the British, the Russians, and even the SS. He knew what fear looked like on other men, and he knew what it looked like on himself. But there was one night he could not explain, one night on a small island most of Europe had never heard of. He wrote, "They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead." We had never encountered that before. Not from the British, not from the Russians, not even from the SS. He was not describing Normandy. He was not describing Berlin. He was describing a single night action against a unit that barely appeared on German maps. He was describing the United States Marine Corps. For 80 years, we have told this story from the American side, the flags, the beaches, the legend, but tonight we are going to tell it differently. Tonight we are going to hear it from the men on the other side of the wire, the men who had to write it down, and what they wrote, stripped of pride and propaganda, was always the same terrible sentence. We were not ready for this. The town was called Miesbach, and in the winter it went silent under the snow. Friedrich lived on a narrow street near the church. In the mornings, he taught history to teenagers who had been born into the ruins their fathers left behind. In the evenings, he sat at a small desk beneath a single lamp, and he wrote. He was writing the thing he had promised himself he would never write, because for 12 years he had told himself that some memories were better left, buried in the frozen ground where he had left so many other things. He had commanded men. He had watched a continent burn. He had stood at the edge of the largest war in human history, and he had survived it, which was its own kind of guilt. And now, an old man with ink on his fingers, he was trying to explain the one night he had never been able to explain to anyone, including himself. The lamp buzzed. Outside, the snow fell without sound. He wrote the sentence, and then he sat back and looked at it for a long time. They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead. To understand why those words cost him so much, you have to understand the man who wrote them. And to understand the man, you have to understand the machine that made him. By the summer of 1942, the German army was the most experienced fighting force on the face of the earth. This was not propaganda. It was arithmetic. Poland had fallen in 5 weeks. France, the great power that had bled Germany white a generation before, had collapsed in 6. The British had been driven into the sea at Dunkirk and had left their equipment burning on the beaches. In the east, German divisions had advanced 800 kilometers into the Soviet Union in a single season, farther than Napoleon, faster than anyone believed possible. 3 years of this had taught the German officer corps something that no amount of training could teach. It had taught them how to read an enemy they had developed without ever writing it down as doctrine. A precise and pitiless taxonomy of the men they fought. The British were disciplined. They held ground with a stubbornness that could be admired, but they were reactive. In defense, they were formidable, and in attack, they were predictable. And a predictable enemy is an enemy you can plan against. The Australians were aggressive, sometimes reckless, dangerous in a brawl, but too dependent on the initiative of individual men. Take away the sergeant, and the line wavered. The Soviets were something the Germans did not have a comfortable word for. In the reports, they called them inexhaustible. It was a clinical word chosen to hide a feeling that officers were not supposed to have. You could kill them by the tens of thousands, and in the morning there would be more coming across the snow in numbers that made a man question the arithmetic of his own survival. And then in late 1942, in significant numbers, for the first time, There were the Americans. The German assessment of the American soldier was not cruel. It was almost gentle in its condescension. The Wehrmacht had a phrase for what it saw arriving off the ships in North Africa: well-equipped amateurs, generously supplied, rich beyond the dreams of any German quartermaster, backed by an industrial capacity that frightened the men who understood logistics, but green, untested, soft in the way that a nation grown comfortable becomes soft. They would fight adequately. The assessment held until the first real shock, and then, like all soft army, they would break for a while. The evidence seemed to prove the assessment correct. In February of 1943, at a place called the Kasserine Pass in the mountains of Tunisia, American forces met Rommel's veterans for the first time in a real battle. What happened next was not a defeat. It was a rout. In 3 days, the Americans lost thousands of men killed, wounded, and captured. Green units broke and streamed to the rear. Equipment was abandoned. Commanders lost control. The German officers who watched it happen filed their reports with a quiet confidence. The taxonomy held. The Americans were exactly what the Wehrmacht had said they were. But there was a detail those reports did not account for, because several thousand kilometers away, on islands that barely appeared on any German strategic map, there was another kind of American soldier. And the men who fought that soldier were writing reports that did not fit the taxonomy at all. They were not Army reports. They were not even German reports. Not at first. They came from the Japanese, and they were passed to German military attaches in Tokyo as part of the routine exchange between allies. And when the German analysts in Berlin first read them, they assumed the strange language was a product of Japanese exaggeration. The reports described a unit called the United States Marine Corps. The Marines had come ashore on an island named Guadalcanal in the Solomon Chain on the 7th of August, Etienne Joubert. It was a place of jungle and fever and mud, a green hell at the end of a supply line, so thin it was nearly imaginary. And the Marines had taken the airfield in 2 days. That was not the part that troubled the analysts. The part that troubled them was what the Marines did next. The Japanese, who outnumbered them in the jungle beyond the airfield, had expected the Americans to do what all Western armies did at the end of a fragile supply line. They expected them to dig in, to wait, to hoard their ammunition and cling to their perimeter and behave like men who understood how exposed they were. Instead, the Marines went into the jungle. They went in at night. They went in looking for the enemy rather than waiting for him. And the Japanese, veterans of years of hard fighting in China, began to file reports that read less like military documents and more like something whispered around a fire. Understand what that jungle was. The dark under those trees was not the ordinary dark of a European night. It was total, a blackness so complete that a man could not see his own hand. And it was alive. It breathed. It dripped. The heat did not fall with the sun. It thickened. Insects the size of a thumb moved across the skin, and the smell of rot rose from the mud in waves. The smell of vegetation and standing water, and before long, of the dead who could not be recovered. Into that, the Marines walked on purpose. They smeared their faces black. They wrapped their gear so it would not rattle. They left the safety of the wire and the guns behind them, and they went hunting for veteran soldiers on ground. Those soldiers knew better than they did. To the Japanese sentries, the jungle simply produced death. A man would be at his post at midnight, and by the gray of dawn he would be gone. Or worse, still there, and cold, no shot, no cry, nothing but the ordinary noise of the jungle, which had swallowed whatever passed through it. Veteran troops, men who had marched across China and thought themselves beyond fear. began to dread the hours between midnight and dawn in a way they could not admit in their letters home. And in Berlin, in a warm office far from any jungle, a professional man read these accounts and felt the first small draft of a wind he did not yet have a name for. A Japanese sergeant captured that autumn and, questioned by Allied officers, gave a statement that eventually found its way into the German files. It read, according to the record kept of it, "They hunt at night. Our sentries hear nothing. In the morning we find men dead who had been alive at midnight. We do not hear them. We do not see them. They are not like other Americans. They are not like other Americans." The German analyst who received that report did something revealing. He did not accept it and he did not discard it. He wrote a note in the margin in the careful cursive hand of a man trained to trust only verified data. The note, as it survived, read, "Verify through additional sources. This does not correspond to our own observations of American infantry capability." It was a reasonable note. It was the note of a professional, and he would spend the next 2 years watching the reports pile up against it, one after another, each one confirming the thing he had asked to have disproven. There was a German intelligence officer assigned to make sense of the reports flowing in from the Pacific, and at some point in that long process, he wrote a single line into an internal assessment that says more than any statistic could. He wrote, "The American Marine infantry units display a willingness for close combat that we have not observed in other Western forces. Their junior officers attack. This is not common." 4 words at the end. This is not common. To an outsider, they mean nothing. To anyone who has read military intelligence, they are extraordinary. Intelligence officers are trained to strip feeling out of language, to reduce the chaos of war to categories a general can act on. When such a man writes, "This is not common," he is not making an observation. He is making a confession. He is saying, in the only way his training will permit, we do not have a box for this. Our categories have failed. Something is out there that we did not prepare for. And this was the thing that made the whole business so unsettling. Everything else about the Americans had fit. The wealth had fit. The green troops at Kasserine had fit. The taxonomy that had correctly measured the British and the Australians, and even the terrible Soviets, had absorbed the American army without difficulty. But it could not absorb the Marines. They were the same nation. The same factories built their rifles. The same democracy, soft and comfortable and distant from war, had raised them. By every theory the Germans held about what produced good soldiers, the Marines should have been no different from the men who ran at Kasserine. Same people, same culture, same effort, rich, untested country. And yet on the other side of the world, they were making veteran Japanese soldiers write reports that sounded like ghost stories. And they were making a meticulous German analyst write and rewrite a single skeptical note in the margin of a file until the note itself became an embarrassment. Something had been done to these men, something deliberate. The Germans could see the effect long before they could name the cause. The way you see the bend of grass before you feel the wind. And the men who had felt that wind directly, the ones who had stood in the dark and watched it come toward them across the wire, would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe it. One of them was an old school teacher in Bavaria, sitting under a lamp in the winter of 1955, writing a sentence he had carried for 12 years. They came at us in the dark like men who had decided they were already dead. He had written the sentence. Now he had to try to explain it, and that he was beginning to understand was going to take the rest of the book. To understand what the Germans were reading, you have to leave the warm office in Berlin and go to the place the reports came from. You have to go to the ridge. The Marines who held the line around Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in October of 1942 were not fresh troops. They had been on the island for more than 2 months. They were sick. Malaria burned through the ranks so completely that a man running a fever of 102 was considered fit for duty, because the alternative was a line with no one in it. They were hungry. The supply line that fed them was cut, restored, and cut again by a Japanese navy that owned the water around the island after dark. They ate captured rice. They ate what they could carry. Their uniforms rotted off their bodies in the wet heat, and their boots came apart, and their skin broke out in sores that would not heal. These were the men the Japanese command had decided to destroy. The plan belonged to Lieutenant General Maruyama, and it was a good plan, built on sound arithmetic. He would bring roughly 3,000 soldiers through the jungle south of the airfield, along a route so difficult the Americans would never expect an attack from that direction. He would strike at night in 3 waves, and he would overwhelm the thin American line by weight of numbers before the defenders could bring their heavier weapons to bear. The section of line his men marched toward was held by fewer than 1,000 Marines, and at the point of heaviest impact, the defense came down to a single reinforced battalion under a lieutenant colonel named Lewis Puller. Puller was not a large man, but there was something about him that men remembered for the rest of their lives. He had a barrel chest and a voice that carried across a battlefield, and a complete, almost frightening absence of doubt. He did not believe in comfort. He did not believe in retreat as a solution to anything. He believed that a Marine was placed on a line to hold it, and that the enemy's job was to try to make him leave, and that the entire purpose of a Marine's existence was to disappoint the enemy in that hope. There is a photograph of Puller from around this time, and if you look at it, you will not understand it. He looks ordinary. He looks like a man you might pass on a street and never notice. That is the first lesson of these islands, that the thing which made these men what they were did not show on the outside. It was not in the jaw or the shoulders. It was somewhere the camera could not reach. The men on his line that night were, on paper, in no condition to fight anyone. Consider what 2 months on Guadalcanal had done to a human body. The malaria came in waves, a fever that soaked a man's blanket through and left him shivering in 90-degree heat, and then broke and then came back. Dysentery hollowed men out until their belts wrapped nearly twice around them. Tropical ulcers ate into the skin and would not close in the perpetual wet. The men were, in the clinical language of the medical reports, unfit. They should have been in hospital beds. Instead, they were lying in the mud behind a strand of wire with rifles they had cleaned and recleaned obsessively, because a rifle that jams in the rain on Guadalcanal is a death sentence, and they knew it. And cleaning the rifle was one of the few things a man could still control. The rain came first. On the night of the 24th, it fell in sheets so heavy the men could not see the wire in front of them. And then, out of that rain, the sound came, a whistle, a bugle, the high, keening cry of hundreds of men rising from the mud at once and running toward the guns. What happened over the next several hours does not read in the Japanese accounts like a battle that was lost through bad luck or poor planning. It reads like men colliding with something they did not understand. The first wave hit the wire, and the Marine line lit up. Machine guns firing on fixed lines cut lanes through the charging infantry. Mortar rounds walked back and forth across the approaches, but there were so many of them, and the Marines were so few that in places the attackers reached the wire and began to tear at it and climb it and die on it, while the men behind them came on anyway. And then Puller's Marines did something that requires a specific kind of mind to do. They called the artillery down on their own position. Think about what that decision means. To pick up a radio or a field telephone in the middle of a human wave assault and give the coordinates of your own hole in the ground, to ask the guns behind you to drop their shells within meters of your own body, is not an act of courage in the ordinary sense. Courage is standing your ground. This was something colder. This was a calculation made under the worst conditions a human being can experience, that the risk of your own shells was preferable to the certainty of being overrun. And then it was the discipline to make that call clearly, to speak the numbers into the radio without your voice shaking so badly the man on the other end could not understand you. The shells came down. They fell among the attackers and they fell among the wire, and they fell close enough to the Marines that the earth heaved under them and the concussion stole the breath from their lungs. And when the smoke cleared, the first wave was gone, and the second was already coming through the bodies of the first. For the men on the line, the night had no shape. There was no battle they could see, no front they could read. Only the small, violent world lit by the muzzle flashes directly around them. A man knew the enemy had reached the wire when a shape came out of the rain close enough to touch. He knew the line to his left was in trouble when the sound of the guns there changed. Beyond that he knew nothing, and could know nothing, and had to fight anyway, in a darkness where the difference between a friend and an enemy was often a single second of hesitation that a man could not afford to take. This is the condition these men had been built for. Not the parade ground and not the recruiting poster, but exactly this, the total confusion of a night assault where no one is coming to tell you what to do, where the officer who was supposed to make the decision is dead or unreachable or fighting for his own life 10 meters away, and the decision falls to you, a private corporal, a boy of 19 with a rifle and a choice, and the choice always on every island was the same. Hold the line, fill the gap, take the guns back, go forward. The second wave broke on the wire with the dead of the first still hanging there. The third wave, according to the language of the reports that survived, hesitated. That word deserves to be sat with. The Imperial Japanese Army did not train men to hesitate. It trained men to die going forward. And it considered hesitation under fire a stain that dishonored a man and his family and his emperor. For a Japanese account to admit that a wave hesitated is very nearly for it to admit the unadmittable. Something on that line had reached into veteran soldiers and found the one thing their entire culture had been built to remove, and it had switched it back on. A Japanese company commander, captured weeks later in a separate action, tried to explain it to the officers who questioned him. The record of what he said reads, "We expected the Americans to be afraid of dying. They were not afraid. This we did not understand." This was the problem. A German intelligence officer, reading a translation of that interrogation many weeks and many thousands of miles later, underlined the final sentence. And then in the margin, in that neat cursive, he wrote a line that reveals how deeply the reports had begun to work on the men who read them. He wrote, "This is the only honest assessment we have received among the men who appear in these reports. One name comes back again and again from different prisoners in different interrogations, described by men who had no way of comparing their stories. His name was John Basilone. He was 25 years old that autumn. Before the Marines, he had served a hitch in the Army and had even served in the Philippines, and had come home and driven a truck and worked, as they say a man works, when he is waiting for the thing his life is actually for. Then he joined the Marines, and the thing his life was for found him on a ridge on Guadalcanal. Basilone was a machine gunner, and by every account of the men who knew him, he was quiet, not shy, quiet in the particular way of men who do not need to fill silence because they are entirely certain of who they are. In the chaos that produced visible panic in other men, in the noise and the rain and the human waves, Basilone was calm, not brave in the theatrical sense, calm, which is rarer and in combat is worth more. When the Japanese overran the guns to his left, Basilone did not wait for orders. There were no orders to wait for. He moved through active fire toward the disabled position, and he cleared the guns, and he got them firing again. When one of the weapons jammed, he stripped it and repaired it in the dark by feel. His hands, doing work that men practice 10,000 times in daylight precisely, so that they can do it once in the dark with death all around them. When the ammunition ran low, he ran for more. He went back through the assault, through the ground. The Japanese were fighting to cross, carrying belts of ammunition. And he came back, and he did it again. When his gunners fell, he worked the weapons himself, moving between two guns, firing one while the other cooled, keeping both barrels alive so the enemy could not tell how few men were actually holding that stretch of line. The barrels of a machine gun fired that hard do not stay cool. They glow, they warp. The water in the cooling jackets boils away and must be refilled with whatever is at hand. And men who fought beside gunners like Basilone came home with stories of weapons so hot the air above them shimmered, of hands burned raw on the metal of a gun kept firing past every reasonable limit, because the moment it stopped was the moment the line broke and everyone behind it died. Basilone worked in that furnace for hours. He did not do it in a rush of glory that a man might summon once and never again. He did it steadily, methodically, the way a craftsman works, feeding and firing and clearing and moving, hour after hour, as if the survival of every man on that ridge were simply a job in front of him that needed doing. That is the quality the enemy could never quite name. It was not the wild courage of a single desperate charge. It was worse than that. From their point of view, it was durable. It did not burn out. It could be summoned again the next night, and the night after that, by thousands of men at once, which meant it was not a matter of individual heroes at all. It was a property of the whole force, and a property of the whole force is not luck. It is design. He held through the night. He held, and in the morning, when the sun came up on that ridge and showed what the darkness had hidden, the ground in front of his position was covered with the men who had tried to take it. He was awarded the Medal of Honor, the highest decoration his country could give. But the medal is the American side of the story, and this is not a story told from the American side. The more interesting document is what the enemy said about him afterward, when they thought no one who cared was listening. Several survivors of the October fighting, questioned separately by different officers at different times, with no ability to coordinate their account, described a single American who would not stop. One of them, according to the record, told his interrogator, "We thought he was not human. We knew he must be killed, but he did not stop, so we believed he could not be killed." That testimony was transmitted to Berlin in a routine intelligence digest, one document among thousands. And a German officer reading it stopped and made a note that shows a professional mind beginning to take something seriously against its own will. The note observed that the Japanese soldier was not, by cultural habit, given to describing his enemies as supernatural. If Japanese soldiers were calling an American enemy something beyond human, the note reasoned, then something exceptional had occurred, and the unit responsible should be studied more carefully. They studied it, and the more they studied, the worse the arithmetic became, because Guadalcanal was not an exception. Guadalcanal was the beginning of a pattern, and the pattern got clearer and more disturbing with every island. A year later, in November of 1740, that pattern arrived at a place called Tarawa. Tarawa was an atoll, a ring of coral in the central Pacific, and the main island in it was called Betio, a strip of sand and palm barely half a square mile in size. On that tiny scrap of ground, the Japanese had built one of the most concentrated defensive positions of the entire war, bunkers of concrete and coconut logs and sand, so low and so hard that naval shells skipped off them, guns sighted to cover every meter of the beach and the water in front of it, nearly 5,000 defenders. Many of them elite naval troops dug into a fortress they had been ordered to hold to the last man. The Japanese admiral in command was reported to have told his staff that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to take the atoll. Whether he truly said those exact words, no one can now be certain, but the confidence behind them was real. And it was not foolish. It was based on the hard mathematics of the position. By every conventional calculation, BDO should have cost far more than it was worth and should have held far longer than it did. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was terrible. And the way the cost was paid is the part the German analysts could not stop returning to. The naval bombardment, tremendous as it was, failed to destroy the hardened defenses. Worse, the tide did not behave. The landing craft coming in across the reef that ringed the island, hung up on the coral hundreds of meters from the beach. The great steel boats that were supposed to carry the Marines to the sand simply stopped, grounded, exposed, and so the Marines got out of the boats into chest-deep water, hundreds of meters from shore, and they waded across an open lagoon in daylight, under the direct fire of every gun the Japanese had sighted on that beach. There was no cover, there was nowhere to go but forward or down. The water around them was struck into foam by machine gun fire and torn open by shells, and men fell and did not rise. And the survivors kept walking, because the only thing worse than walking forward through that water was stopping in the middle of it. The casualties in the first 2 hours were beyond anything the Marines had yet paid. Whole boat teams were destroyed before they reached the sand. Officers were killed leading their men out of the water. And precisely this is the detail the German reports circled and underlined and could not explain. The Marines whose officers were killed kept advancing. Understand what that means against the framework. The Germans held, in the Wehrmacht's model of war, and in almost every model of war, the removal of leadership degrades a unit, kill the officers, and the men lose direction. They go to ground. They wait for someone to tell them what to do, and if no one comes, they eventually pull back. This is not cowardice. It is how armies are built to work. The officer is the nervous system. Cut it, and the body slows. At Tarawa, the body did not slow. Squads that had lost their lieutenants kept moving toward the seawall. Platoons that had lost half their men kept moving. Groups with no radio, no orders, no contact with anyone above them, no certainty about anything in the world except the 10 meters of sand immediately in front of them, kept moving forward into those 10 meters, and then into the next 10, and the next, until the fortress that was supposed to hold for 100 years had been taken apart bunker by bunker by men who had every reason to stop and did not. Of the nearly 5,000 defenders, a tiny handful survived to be taken prisoner. 17 men, not 17%, 17 men out of an entire garrison. The German analysis of Tarawa was extensive and, by the flat standards of intelligence writing, almost agitated. One of the post-war German assessments described the battle as the most concentrated example of offensive spirit under adverse conditions encountered in any theater of the war. It went further. It observed that the Marine losses in those first hours should have produced a military paralysis. Instead, it said they produced an acceleration. That sentence is worth stopping on, because it is the whole mystery in 6 words. Their losses produced an acceleration. In every model, the Germans possessed casualties slowed an attack. Fear is a rational response to watching the men beside you die. And fear, accumulated across a unit, brings an assault to a halt, that is not weakness. That is human nature. And human nature is the one constant that military science can usually rely on. The Marines had found a way to break that constant. The more they were hurt, the faster they came. And the men on the other side, who had spent their lives learning to read the rhythm of an enemy attack, found themselves facing a rhythm that ran backward, that grew stronger where it should have grown weaker. And they did not know what to do with it because there was nothing in their experience that matched it. A Japanese officer who survived Tarawa, pulled from the water after the island fell, tried to put it into words during his interrogation. What he said was very short. He said, "Marines are not soldiers. Marines are something else." The German analyst who read the translated version of that statement wrote 4 words beside it in red ink. "We agree. We do not yet know what." And that was the state of the German understanding by the end of 1943. They had gathered enough to know beyond any doubt that the thing they were looking at was real. It was not Japanese exaggeration. It was not luck. It was not the accident of a single heroic night on a single ridge. It repeated on Guadalcanal, and it repeated on Tarawa, and it would repeat. They were beginning to suspect everywhere these men were sent. But knowing that a thing is real is not the same as understanding it. The Germans could measure the effect with terrible precision. They could count the 17 survivors. They could plot the casualties and note the acceleration and underline the confessions of veteran soldiers who had never confessed to fear before. What they could not do, not yet, was answer the question that sat underneath all of it. The question the schoolteacher in Bavaria was still trying to answer at his desk a decade later. Not what these men did. They had pages and pages of why these men and not the men at Kasserine? Why the Marines and not the rest of the army that came from the same country and carried the same rifles? Why an assault grew faster when it should have stopped? And why a wave of veteran Japanese infantry in the rain on a ridge had done the one thing they were forged never to do? Why they had hesitated? The answer was coming. It was not hidden in a secret weapon or a classified doctrine. It was written down in plain language in the training manuals of the United States, Marine Corps, and in the words of the men who ran the schools that made these soldiers. But before the Germans reached that answer, the war had one more island to show them. The worst one, the one that would take everything the Marines had learned to do and everything the enemy had learned to fear, and press it into 36 days of volcanic ash. For the German officers reading these files, the accumulation had become almost unbearable in its consistency. A single extraordinary report can be dismissed. A brave unit, a lucky night, a commander of unusual gifts. These things occur in every army and prove nothing about the whole. But the reports did not describe a single unit or a single night. They described the same phenomenon appearing again and again in different places, under different commanders, against different Japanese formations, separated by a year and thousands of kilometers of ocean. Guadalcanal and Tarawa had nothing in common except the men who fought there and the men who studied them from the far side of the world. And that was the thing that turned professional curiosity into something closer to unease. The Germans prided themselves on understanding war more deeply than anyone alive. They had built the doctrine the rest of the world was still trying to copy. And here, in file after file, was a force that behaved in a way their doctrine could not explain, that grew stronger under conditions their model said should destroy it, and that had been produced, apparently deliberately, by a nation they had dismissed as too soft to fight. The analyst who had written Verify through additional sources in the margin of that first report had long since stopped asking for verification. The sources had verified themselves 100 times over. What he wanted now was not more evidence, What he wanted was an explanation, and the explanation was waiting on one more island. Its name was Iwo Jima. By the 19th of February, the Germans no longer needed the reports to tell them what the Marines could do. They needed them to tell them why. And the last island in the story did not answer the question so much as it burned the question down to its final, unavoidable shape. Iwo Jima was 8 square miles of volcanic rock in the middle of the ocean. And the man who defended it did not make the mistakes his predecessors had made. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi had studied the earlier battles. He had watched the Japanese die by the thousands charging into marine fire on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, and he had concluded that such charges were a waste. So he did not build his defense on the beaches. He built it underground. His men cut miles of tunnels into the volcanic rock. A whole hidden city of galleries and bunkers and gun positions linked below the surface, hardened so deeply that the kind of naval bombardment which had not been enough at Tarawa was now simply irrelevant. Kuribayashi did not intend to stop the Marines at the water. He intended to let them come and then to kill them from the rock, day after day, at a price so high that something in the American nation would finally crack. This was not the plan of a fanatic. Kuribayashi had lived in the United States. He had traveled its cities and seen its factories and understood better than most men in the Japanese command that Japan could not win the war outright. His logic was subtler and more dangerous than victory. He meant to make the cost of taking the island so enormous that American will would fail before American capacity did. And that logic was not foolish. It was drawn from the European War, where high casualties had again and again produced political pressure to stop, to negotiate, to count the price and decide it was too much. There was only one factor Kuribayashi could not put into his calculation, because he had never fought it and could not have known it existed. The specific psychological architecture of the men who were about to come ashore. The Marines took roughly 26,000 casualties on Iwo Jima. Nearly 7,000 of them were killed. It was the costliest battle in the history of the Marine Corps. And they took the island. There is a photograph almost everyone alive has seen. 6 men raising a flag on the summit of Mount Suribachi. It went up on the 23rd of February, 4 days into the fighting, and it became instantly one of the most famous images ever made. It is a picture of triumph, and the country received it as triumph, and it deserves that place. But the flag is the symbol. It is not the reality. The island was not declared secure until the 26th of March. In the 31 days between the raising of that flag and the actual end of the battle, more than 1,000 additional Marines were killed and thousands more were wounded. The famous image was taken with an entire month of the worst fighting still ahead. That is the truth. The reports recorded and the monuments cannot. The photograph is the beginning of the hardest part, not the end of it. To grasp what those 31 days were, you have to understand the ground. Iwo Jima was not soil. It was volcanic ash, loose and gray and deep, and it swallowed a man's boots to the ankle and slid out from under him when he tried to run. It stank of sulfur. The rock beneath it was warm in places from the volcanic heat below, so that a Marine digging a hole for cover might find the earth growing hot around him. There was almost no natural cover on the open ground, and every meter of it was covered by guns. The Marines could not see, fired from within the rock, and then withdrawn before the fire could be returned. A man could be killed by an enemy he never once laid eyes on, from a position that vanished the moment it had done its work. Into that, day after day, the Marines advanced. They did not take the island in a charge. They took it in yards, clearing one cave, one bunker, one hardened position at a time, using flame and explosive and their own bodies to reach places that shells could not touch. It was the slowest, most deliberate kind of killing, with no glory in it and no relief. And the men who did it knew from the first hour how long it was going to take and what it was going to cost. And they did it anyway. That is the thing the enemy could not model. Not a moment of desperate courage, but the willingness to get up on the second morning and the 10th and the 30th and walk back into the ash. They had been broken already, long before, in a place of their own choosing. And so this place held no power left to break them. A Japanese officer who survived the caves and was captured put the thing into words with a clarity that reached all the way to Berlin. According to the record, he told his interrogators, "We planned for American soldiers. We did not plan for men who could watch their friends die and then take another step forward. We did not know this was possible." He was not calling them superhuman. He was describing something far more precise and far more chilling to a professional soldier. He was describing men who had been trained to absorb the death of the man beside them in real time, to feel it and keep functioning, to process in the middle of a battle a loss that would have stopped almost anyone else. Not men who did not feel it, men who felt it and moved anyway. And that, finally, is where the Germans found their answer, not in a weapon, not in a secret, in a training doctrine that the Marine Corps had never bothered to hide, because the strange truth was that the source of all this could be read by anyone who cared to look. The Marines did not believe that men became hard in battle. That was the ordinary theory, the one most armies ran on, that you took a civilian and gave him a rifle and some drill and let combat finish the job. The Marines rejected it. They believed that a man had to be made hard before the battle so that the battle itself would be a familiar country rather than a shock. The suffering of their training was not there to build strong bodies, though it did that. It was there to take a man to the very edge of what he could endure again and again, until that edge became a place he recognized, so that when combat drove him to it, he would look around and understand where he was, and remember that he had stood in this place before, and that the last time he had not broken. Colonel Merritt Edson, who had led Marines through some of the worst fighting on Guadalcanal, was asked after the war what he thought was the single most important factor in how Marines performed in combat. His answer was not about weapons or tactics or supply. He said, in effect, we break them before the enemy can, and then they are not afraid of being broken anymore. A German officer, reading a translation of that line in a post-war study, marked it with a single comment. The comment was one sentence, and it may be the most perceptive thing any of them ever wrote about the men who had haunted their files for years. He wrote, Clausewitz described friction. These men removed it. Friction was the great German word for everything that goes wrong in war. The fear, the fog, the exhaustion, the 1,000 small failures that drag on an army and slow it and make the simple impossible. Every commander in history had accepted friction as a permanent condition, something to be managed but never defeated. And here was an American officer, in a plain sentence, describing a system built to reach into a man before the war ever touched him and remove the friction at its source, not to manage fear, to finish it in training so that it would not be there to manage when it mattered. Which brings us back to a desk in Bavaria and an Olmen ohne Lamp, and a sentence he had carried for 12 years. Friedrich Raus finished his memoir in 1955. He lived out his years teaching history in that small town, a man who had commanded soldiers and now explained old wars to teenagers. And in the copy of the book that stayed in his family, next to the passage about the men who came in the dark, there is a note in his handwriting, added years after the book was done. He had gone on thinking about it. He could not leave it alone. The note reads, I have thought about this for 12 years. I believe now that I described it incorrectly, They had not decided they were already dead. They had decided that being dead was acceptable. There is a difference. There is a difference, and the whole of it lives in that difference. A man who has decided he is already dead has given up. He is finished, hollow, waiting for the end. But a man who has decided that death is acceptable has done the opposite of giving up. He has set down the one weight that stops other men. He has answered in advance the question that paralysis is built on, and having answered it, he is free. Free to move, free to decide, free to go forward into the open ground, that every other instinct in his body is screaming at him to avoid. These were free men. That is what made them dangerous. And the last thing the enemy testimony reveals, across a decade of Pacific War and thousands of pages of analysis, is that this freedom was not natural. These men were not born with it. It was not a gift of American culture or a product of democratic air. It was built deliberately and systematically in the barracks and on the obstacle courses and in the long punishing marches at Parris Island and San Diego before a single shot of the war had been fired. The Marines had decided before the war came exactly what kind of men they would need, and then one recruit at a time, they had built them, and on island after island, in the jungle dark and the coral shallows and the volcanic ash, those men had met the enemy, and the enemy had written down what they saw, stripped of pride and propaganda and mythology, filed in the cold language of men who had every reason to lie and no reason left to bother. What they wrote was always, in the end, the same thing. We were ready for the war. We were not ready for this.